This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Connecticut is known for a lot of things. Pizza, Mark Twain, Long Island Sound, just to name a few. But Connecticut is also known as the Aerospace Alley. Throughout history, our state has made big contributions to aviation technology. The future of air travel is a little uncertain, and it takes a lot of manpower to get these big ideas off the ground. Today, we're talking about the history and future of aviation in our state. We hear from some aviation enthusiasts whose love of all things plane is going to make you soar. Helping us take flight today from the New England Air Museum in Windsor Locks here in Connecticut is Stephanie Abrams. She's the president and CEO of the New England Air Museum, and we also have Mike Thornton, who is a curator at the museum. Thanks, Stephanie, for being with us today.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having us.
And also lovely to have you on with us as well, Mike.
Yes, hello.
And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation. Leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So I want to start with you, Mike. Before we learn more about the museum, obviously have to ask both of you, how did you get interested in planes?
Yeah, I came to it kind of in a roundabout, odd way. And then the planes are beautiful and they smell great and they're loud and fast. But in the 1990s, when I was a teenager, World War II was at its 50th anniversary. And a lot of the veterans began to really talk about the experiences of the air war. And these were young men who had grown up in the 1920s and 30s being told that airplanes were going to play a dramatic role in the future affairs of the world. And here they were fighting the greatest global air battles of all time. And the stories they told differed from the stories that I was reading in my history books. And I became so fascinated by the men and women who were behind the planes. And that's kind of stayed with me ever since.
Well, there's definitely something to be said about hearing the stories from the actual people versus reading it, right? I'm a big fan of reading, but there's nothing like a conversation, which is I'm gonna lead into Stephanie here. What's your personal story with aviation?
I grew up with it. My father was in the Air Corps, and he loved to fly. He loved aviation. And he told stories. He wouldn't talk too much, I think, as is true with many people from that generation. He wouldn't talk too much about being engaged in battle, but he loved to fly. And his eyesight changed during the time he was in the Air Corps, so he got his A&P mechanic's license. But after the war, he was stationed in Dayton, where Chuck Yeager was, and he just told me these stories about flying right seat in all of these experimental aircraft. But he also told me stories about times when someone was doing touch and goes in some crazy aircraft and he'd say, "See ya," because he was parachuting out. But anyway, that just started my love of it. And yes, I'm a science nerd. There's a lot of science behind flight, but you know what? It is magic.
That's something I hear a lot, is the word magic being described when it comes to flying in planes. I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? So my grandfather-in-law, he was an Alaskan bush pilot. And so my connection is hearing his stories more from family, because he passed away a couple of years ago, but he flew a P-38 Lightning.
Wow.
And to me, I'm like, that's just, it's unfathomable that you're mapping Alaska. Like, you literally created the map of Alaska by flying around it. Crazy. And my father-in-law was his co-pilot taking photos. And so that's sort of my magical connection. And I love that everyone sort of has that. So, and Mike, as we talk about magic and this captivation, you probably see a lot of people with that glint in their eye when they're in the museum, seeing these planes maybe for the first time, or they've heard stories. Why does aviation matter? Why are so many people into this still?
It has this aura about it. It verges on a religion, that it's mystical and captivating, and there's this great call to the sky, and it pans out in so many different ways. It's not just the thrill of actually achieving flight, but it's the personalities and that incredible experience of perspective that flight offers, and then all the science and engineering that goes into it. I mean, we're constantly, and Connecticut is at the heart of that. We're constantly striving to achieve the sky. We earn it for a little while, but then we have to reinvent and push back that next envelope. And that story is ongoing, and it will be ongoing until we reach the stars. I mean, really, that's the calling.
Another reason, I think, for me is aviation happened in the blink of an eye, unlike anything else. I mean, in our museum, we have an aircraft called a Charles Pusher. It was built by a 17-year-old from New Britain, from Berlin, Connecticut. And it's very primitive looking. You turn around and you look at the VS-44. It's a flying boat made by Sikorsky, because Igor Sikorsky intuited that there would not be runways long enough for aircraft, so he built one that takes off and lands in water. But you can see there, and that it was less than 20 years later. And then we're on the moon, and now there's civilian space travel. So there's something magic in how quickly it happened, and also it changed the way we live, and it continues to change the way we live.
And both of you mentioned, what a big role aviation has played and still playing here in Connecticut. So, Stephanie, I want to ask you, Connecticut is actually known as the Aerospace Alley, as we mentioned earlier, a big industry here in the state. Can you talk about some of the state's history with planes and how our state has contributed to the aviation technology?
Absolutely. I mean, I think right now of Igor Sikorsky, who he was a visionary, truly born during the birth of aviation. He was building aircraft. There were no manuals back then.
Right.
There was no MIT to go to. Right. It was just brilliance. And again, he was a visionary. He claimed, or he believed, that they were divine visions. But it went on from there. And so between Pratt & Whitney, Sikorsky, Barnes Aerospace, and then the hundreds and hundreds of suppliers to these engine makers and the people who are creating the aircraft as well.
And Sikorsky, did he also make the first commercial helicopter?
Yes, he did.
Yes. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was fly. He crashed a lot, and he tested his own aircraft until they finally decided, maybe we shouldn't let Igor test all the aircraft because we need him.
Right. And I imagine those parts are very expensive to lose with every crash. Granted, we should learn from failure. That's a good story to learn from, but maybe not so many expensive parts to be a part of that. And Mike, what's your perspective in terms of how aviation developed over time here in Connecticut?
Well, it's this incredible, it's also a story of economics in that, a lot of people don't realize that New York and Long Island had this huge early aviation epicenter, but real estate is expensive.
Right.
And Connecticut being, almost not quite on the cusp of a post-industrial landscape, but there was a calling in the 1920s and 30s that there was available land. You need a lot of space, and you need, factories and to build these incredible, large, complicated machines. And Rentschler with Pratt & Whitney and Sikorsky later on, and then of course the massive facilities at at Hamilton. Connecticut had all the right stuff to become an aviation industrial landscape.
Well, and then speaking of machines, can you talk about some of the aircrafts and engines that are stored in the museum, and why do you think it's important for people to see them in person?
Well, it's one, it's a testament to the material product of the ingenuity and innovation and labor of so many New England residents, but it also charts this incredible technological, and again, what Stephanie was saying earlier, that this all happened in such a rapid amount of time. It was like every 6 months some new thing was being pushed, and Pratt's evolution into jets, Hamilton's work for props that could rotate and change pitch, and there was always something that was going forward. People like Amelia Earhart, all the icons and the power brokers of the aviation scene were coming here and working with Connecticut engineers and designers to push the frontiers of aviation forward.
And they're still pushing forward because now there's a focus on autonomous flight, aircraft that truly fly themselves. And it's not that they're controlled by someone on the ground. I mean, with the AI algorithms, they fly themselves. So there's another step change going on in aviation right now. But one thing I also want to add, you're asking about what we have at the museum. In addition to the actual hardware, we also have the stories of the people behind the aircraft. I mean, one good example is the last major restoration was A-10 Warthog. And, it's people call it a weapon on wings and has this Gatling firearm inside. But when we had the ceremony for people to dedicate it, we had a brigadier general talking about when he flew it, why it flies low and slow, and hearing the urgency of the troops on the ground. I never looked at the aircraft the same way again. So the stories about the people who designed and who tested, because you really have to have a lot of courage to test. It's just the stories are amazing.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up the humans behind it after talking about AI because, no criticism, but there's something about a human being flying these machines. And Mike, earlier you said something that I wasn't really thinking about, but you said the planes smell great.
Yes.
Now, can you describe what's the scent? Because I can smell the rust when I was at Chino Airport a couple years ago and I went through their junkyard. That blew my mind just to see the parts that you need to put together and turn it into a plane. But I got that. But I want to hear, what are you smelling?
I think this is one of these experiences where until you're around them, you don't realize it. But, despite all the incredible progress of aviation, this sort of future-facing work, at the end of the day, especially prior to the 1970s, planes were very analog on the inside. They smelled like the same scent as an old radio or an electrical train set. I mean, you smelled the electrics, you smelled the oil, you smelled the fuel. And, when we sit, we're lucky enough, especially as a curator and my collections manager, Josh Taylor, who comes from the Smithsonian, we're able to, on occasion, we get to pet the planes.
This is true, they do.
And when you sit in those cockpits and you see the metal and you see the luminescent dials and you hear the clunk of the pedals and you're like, you think of all the things they did, but just how hands-on and handmade these machines were. And that's an echo of the incredible labor that's behind them, the men and women on the line, the factory lines, building these things. And so we have twofold stories. We have, of course, all the stories of the planes and what they did, but we have the story of how they were made. And that's exciting and rare.
Yeah, I just want to throw a quick note into the air to our listeners that you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677. We have Dawn Morgan in East Hartford who just wants to share with us that if we want to know why pilots fly, have us look up and read online High Flight, which is a poem written by an airman. So that's High Flight, written by an airman. Thank you so much, Dawn, for sharing that quick comment with us. And Stephanie mentioned AI earlier, and we want to talk a little bit about the future of aviation. So, Mike, I want to ask you, many are working to make aviation more sustainable. So can you talk a little bit about that? What does the future of aviation look like?
We are at an absolute watershed moment in aviation. And I think one of the great things that if I could encourage anybody out there to, when they visit the museum to be thinking about is that, we think of aviation, it seems like histories kind of end at 1945 or they end with the landing on the moon, but this is not the case. It is always jump-starting this next great endeavor. And we are at this moment where environmental, the concerns with fuel efficiency, the impact of aviation on the air and the atmosphere, the raw economics of the fuel and the logistics to run, airlines, the designs that are being looked at with electrical, with VTOL for vertical flight. I don't think in the next, aviation is always about speculating what the future looks like, but planes are going to look very, very different in the next 30, 40, 50, even 60 years. And, they might not even be recognizable in the way that we see, traditional fixed wing or rotary. They're fusions of all these old designs that are coming out. The things we're looking at are so incredible and mind-blowing. They're magical. And there will be a time where people will have these things in their garage.
That's amazing. And not too far future, I'm thinking, by what you're describing.
No.
Stephanie, final thoughts.
Well, I wanted to tell the gentleman who called in that High Flight is actually printed out in our break room at the museum. So thank you for mentioning
Beautiful.
that.
That's perfect.
But we are going to have a symposium on electric-powered vertical flight probably in March and April because, again, talk about magic. These aircraft look completely different than what we see now, and they're amazing. And sustainability really is the watchword at all of the aviation companies now.
You've been listening to Stephanie Abrams, who's the president and CEO of the New England Air Museum. Stephanie, thank you so much for being with us today.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
And Mike Thornton, who's a curator at the New England Air Museum, will be staying with us. And coming up next, it's one thing to see these planes, and it is another to fly them. We'll hear from a D-Day squadron in Oxford in Connecticut. And aviation enthusiasts, we want to hear from you. Join the conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The New England Air Museum houses some unbelievable aircrafts. Many are no longer in use, but can you imagine actually flying in one of these vintage planes? I think it'd be pretty cool. But what's also cool is that Bob Curator has landed in our studios today. He's a crew chief and docent on the Placid Lassie aircraft. Bob, welcome to Where We Live today.
Thank you.
And also with us is Mike Thornton, who's the curator of the New England Air Museum. And just a quick reminder for our listeners that you can also join the conversation if you like. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So Bob, I want to start off. Can you tell us what is Placid Lassie? And can you describe what your work looks like with it?
Placid Lassie is a DC-3 or C-47. She was built in 1943. It was a transport plane that was used to haul cargo and drop parachuters. She also towed gliders. On D-Day, her first mission was bringing over gliders. I think the first one was a Horsa, a British glider that held 28 paratroopers, and then the next one was I think a CJ-4A that only held 13 paratroopers or infantrymen. Then she went back and hauled over more paratroopers to drop in. So the C-47, this one has been restored, worked on, has a very, very interesting life. It was a warbird to 45, and then at the end of the war, she was retired to Georgia, and then from there, she was sent to the Pacific West Coast. They used it as a transport plane for, 20 years, and then she came and became a cargo dog, and then some guy had it in Georgia, and finally, as a cargo plane, one of the engines failed, and he just didn't have the money to fix it.
Right.
So James Lyle and Eric Zipkin of Tunison, the director, picked up the plane, but it really wasn't Tunison then. And they brought it over 2014 to England. They did a D-Day smaller version, and over there, some old British veterans saw the plane and said, "That's not Yukon Jack Deck, that's Placid Lassie. I know this plane. And your radio operator is still alive." Wow. And they got back to the States. They found him and gave him a ride in the plane, I guess, and shortly after he passed away, but they named the foundation after him. He was the last survivor. So
I think it's amazing hearing the history of where these planes have been, where they've gone through, and where they are now, and the fact that we're having these conversations. I think it's pretty mind-blowing. Mike earlier described, what the inside of a plane smell like. So can you talk about what it's like being inside these planes, Bob?
Well, Lassie has no padding or insulation in the walls.
That's good.
We have some commercial seats to bring the crews around. And it is noisy in there. If you have the headset like for a weed whacker, we'll wear those in the plane. Or if you have your flight headset on that's tuned into the communication system in the plane, you don't really hear it. It's just a background drone. But you take those off and you just hear the roar of those two Pratt & Whitney engines churning along, and it's you're there. And Lassie is a very gentle plane in the air. She seems to have no bad tendencies. But as far as the smell goes, your smell is on the outside. When you start the thing up, there's a lot of smoke. But it's a round motor trait.
Well, how do people react when they see these planes being flown? I feel like we just had a very short conversation about planes, but it seems like a lot of people have very emotional connections to aircraft.
Yes, they do. You can see the crew, and they refer to her, as a living, breathing thing. They take excellent care of her. There's just a mystique about the whole plane. And people come walking in to shows when you land We don't even get the door open, and they're standing there waiting to get in it, you know. So,
well, Mike, I see you nodding and smiling. I think you're
yeah.
about to parachute out of the studio with your excitement. You know, do you agree?
Oh, I do. You know, when you see them, history comes alive. You, for a moment there, you can step back in time, and it brings back, you know, D-Day, or then the glory days of the 1930s, and those sounds and that feel, and seeing those things pass overhead. You know, that's exactly as it was, and it's just grand.
And Bob, you know, these planes are expensive to fly and maintain, I imagine. So can you talk about why is it important to still fly these planes and for people to see them in the air?
Well, it's important that they carry on what people did, the servicemen, what they did with this plane back in the 40s during World War II. And you look at the technology in the plane as it is, and it's amazing what they accomplished. When we're at the show and the old-timers come up and they start talking what they did with the plane, it's absolutely amazing. You know, today, you know, you climb into an airliner and you're up at 42,000 feet, and, you know, no time you're at your destination. Lassie chugging along at, you know, 146 miles an hour and burning 100 gallons an hour of fuel, it's different, you know, and they're listening to her, you know, they have the feel for her. It's again, it's a living, breathing thing.
Well, and Bob, you also do a lot of tours with veterans and also their families. And I know you shared with our producer that you did a tour with a pilot's daughter. Can you tell us that story?
The one where we're at a show and people are lined up. God, there's lines so long, and it could be a 98-degree day, and they'll stand in line to get in there. And this one young lady was, I would probably put her in her, you know, she's 40s, but she's crying. And she had said her father just passed away, and he flew those. Wow. So we talked to the people inside the plane. There's usually a pilot or somebody up front that'll describe things. And she went up there. They let her sit in the seat, and, you know, she came out. She was crying just as much as she went in, but she was very grateful being allowed to see what her father had done. Other people, one old lady came and she said, my husband flew these over the hump. That was from India to Burma, you know, through the mountains. It's incredible to think that this plane did that. And
you know, what goes through your mind when you realize that you're witnessing what you're witnessing? Because, you know, I've done some stories with aviation and with troops flying out with C-17s, knowing that they're bringing cargo to our troops. And I've been in a Piper J3, a small Cub plane, flying over California, and that was an amazing experience. You know, getting a bird's eye view of where you live. But those are kind of quote quote fun experience for me. But you're seeing sort of history coming to present. I think, you know, what goes through your mind when you realize, you know, what you're seeing here.
The first thing goes through my mind is gratitude to be even part of it. And when we do these parachute jumps, there's a lot of veterans. One of them that just recently jumped with us has over 2,000 jumps. And these aren't like today. If you went to a local parachute school, you'd be jumping at 12 or 15,000 feet. These guys went out at about 1,200 feet. And it's a line of sight. They have a jump master laying on the floor, lining up the plane with the drop zone. And just watching this, these guys stand up, they hook their static cord up to this cable along the roof, and when the command comes to go, they just step out and off they go. Some of them carrying 130 pounds of extra equipment with them. And it just makes you grateful for what they did. And some of them flew into some very hostile environments. So it's just so enlightening to be part of it. And every mission we get something new.
Well, and I know you work with Placid Lassie, of course, but do you have other crafts that you love and you love talking about and sharing?
Well, this young man who's one of the pilots, PICs for Lassie, just bought a Stearman, and I'm hoping to get over and help him put it together. get to fly that. I love the open cockpit. I think when you talk about smell and experiencing something, you got to experience open cockpit. Perhaps in the J3 you flew, they had the doors open on the side, and
It was loud.
Yeah. So,
yeah, I was going to say that's one of the incredible features of our museum is that unlike, instead of having these things just purely static, that we do allow visitors into the cockpits of a number of our aircraft and offer special open cockpit days. And it's been a staple of the New England Air Museum for years, but it's one of our great features.
Well, I want to ask both of you this question. We got to go to a break in about 2 minutes here. But Bob, having this conversation about history, clearly we are just scraping the surface today. What do you hope listeners get out from this conversation?
Well, I hope they get their unknown that ground-bound aviators can experience stuff. Tunison is always looking for volunteers. Lassie's kept over in Poughkeepsie in a hangar. And the volunteers, you don't have to be an expert on aircraft. If you've got time and hands, they have lots of things to do. They're also in the midst of restoring a PBY Catalina, a big flying boat. So it's what we hope is that more people will come to help out. There's always room for more hands. As they say, many hands make the load light, and it is true. Last hangar day, we had over 40 people there. Wow. And one of them's an 80-year-old woman.
All right, so basically never too many cooks in a plane. Mike, What about you? Same question. What do you hope our listeners get out from this? Oh,
just the wonder that there are so many stories and ways to intersect with the both past, present, and future with aviation. That it's grand and it's a welcoming and fun scene. So come see the museum. Come see these things fly at air shows, and understand that there's a connection between you see your kids playing with Legos. This can lead to the next great groundbreaking discovery.
So we're going to end with a very quick question. I wonder if one of you can answer this. We have a question from Sid from Facebook. He asks, do we know where the C-47 was built? Was it probably built largely by women workers?
That I can't answer where it was built. I know it was built in 1943 by the Douglas Aircraft Corporation. So whether it was in California, I'm not sure, but I could find that out.
Well, Sid, thank you for that question. Bob is going to find that out for you. All right, thank you so much. You've been listening to Bob Curator, who's a crew chief and docent on the Placid Lassie aircraft. And you've also been listening to Mike Thornton, who's the curator of the New England Air Museum. Thank you both for being on the show today.
Oh, happy to be here.
And coming up next, aviation enthusiasts from all four corners of Connecticut can put on their pilot caps and fly model aircrafts. We'll learn more about that after the break. But first up, here are two of my colleagues to tell you how you can support our work and flight at Connecticut Public. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. If flying in a vintage plane is not your speed, there are more ways you can tap into your inner pilot. There are many model plane clubs here in all four corners of Connecticut, and joining us now is Edward Deming. He's the president of RC Prop Busters of Salem here in Connecticut. Thanks, Ed, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Catherine.
And for our listeners, you can also join the conversation. Leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Ed, you've been listening to us talk about vintage planes, but your thing is model planes. So can you talk about how did you get interested in that in the first place?
Sure. So as Bob mentioned previously, there's a lot of aviation interest across the country, particularly in Connecticut. But a lot of people, kids grew up watching planes. Bradley Airport and other areas. It's very easy to get excited about aircraft, and that's how it started with myself, with building small models with my dad back in the 60s, and then getting into the early radio control stuff with it was actually Central Connecticut Radio Control Club out of Farmington way back when, and have done it off and on ever since. But it leads you into kind of a technical interest, and it can be as complicated as you want, either ready to fly type stuff or building things. In the early days, you had to build all your own things and sometimes even build your own radios. It's a lot easier now, and the equipment's much better.
But I was going to ask, how do people get started in flying models? Because I think it's a little bit more complicated than people think. Maybe even flying the tiny drones that you can get off the internet.
Yeah, so exactly. There are lots of ways that you can get into it, but the best way is to join a club, and particularly a club that's affiliated with the Academy of Model Aeronautics. That's the governing body for model airplane activities, and is FAA approved as a community-based organization for training and with set safety procedures and improved safety procedures. So a club like RC Prop Busters or any one of the other 15 or 16 clubs in Connecticut is a good way to get started. But Academy of Model Aeronautics is the key thing. All of the clubs have usually a dedicated number of instructors, and we all welcome, I think universally the clubs welcome visitors to the flying fields, and people are welcome to watch the flying, and if they have an interest, very often there'll be an instructor there that will have a trainer-type plane with what we call a buddy box, and they can give you basic instruction and take you up and let you try flying without the danger of crashing, because they can take control back very, very quickly.
And these are handheld controls.
They're handheld,
and the planes are in the line of sight type of thing.
Yes, you have to fly what we call visual line of sight. So you're flying usually within several hundred yards or 1,000 yards from your point where you're flying. We have there's a limitation, an altitude limitation of 400 feet above ground level, unless you have a waiver, an FAA waiver. But it's all visual line of sight, and that's part of the excitement. It's kind of like doing a video game, but in real life. And in fact, there are really good simulators, and we often suggest that people get and they're pretty inexpensive, $100, around $100 or less, depending on whether you get a controller with it. And that's a good way to learn without costing a lot of money for crashes. Hitting the reset button's a lot easier than rebuild.
Right, and it's because it sounds like there's so much into it. You got training, you got FAA, you've got guidelines, you got instructors. So what should our listeners know about safety? Are there places that they should not fly? They should fly? How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the safest place to fly is at AMA sponsored club fields, because they're specifically set up so they're away from buildings, they're away from roads. You need a fairly wide space for even the mid-size to large planes. Smaller ones, they're sometimes called park flyers, but that's not always a great idea. You're always better off flying at an established field where there's also an established flight line, pit stations, and flying stations. So, and with some control, crowd control, and also for other pilots, so that you're flying in a safe manner, and everybody knows that they're controlling their own plane, and that there's not too many people up there, so you don't have a traffic jam or anything like that.
It's kind of an on-air dog park, it seems like.
It is a little bit, exactly. It's actually a big social connection for a lot of people.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that too. There's a huge model plane community here in Connecticut. Can you talk about what that's been like? Sure,
there is. So I'll talk about District 1 in the AMA right now, which is all New England. In New England, there are about 12,000 pilots and 110 clubs, and that's a pretty good base. Across the whole country, there's 170,000 pilots and almost 2,500 clubs. So it's a pretty big organization, and it's as like Bob had mentioned when we were talking before we got started here. It's really is a community. As soon as you start talking with people and there's a shared love of aviation and aircraft, they're instant friends.
Well, we have Bob Curator, who's the crew chief and docent of the Placid Lassie aircraft, who is still with us. Bob, you're also involved in the model plane community. Talk about your experience.
Yeah, I'm a member of Quaker Farms RC Club in Oxford, Connecticut, and I'm also a member of the Connecticut Silent Flyers in Newtown, Connecticut. And it's been a rewarding experience to meet all those people that are in there. They all work together to keep the field safe and in good condition to fly. It's absolutely been one of the best things I could get involved with. Shy of buying a $2 million plane, you can buy one for a few $100 and experience flying.
That seems a bit more reasonable.
Right.
Yeah.
We're the earthbound aviators.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
I love that. It kind of changes how I view armchair traveling.
Yeah.
Earthbound aviators.
ground-bound aviators.
I
Yeah,
love that.
yeah.
I love that. And earlier we talked about too, the magic of aviation and keeping the curiosity sort of alive through museums and air shows and whatnots. What about having kids being more involved in, say, STEM classes?
Yeah, so that's a huge thing, Catherine. In fact, our particular club, RC Prop Busters, we do we call it a neighborhood fun fly, but any of the public are welcome to come in, and we'll set up 6 to 8 stations with only 4 flying at any one given time, but 6 to 8 stations with people with what we call buddy boxes, and we'll give people a chance to fly, and children in particular. We have several kids that are in the club, active members right now, and they started out through one of these type of things, and it's the neighborhood community. They really enjoy it, and it also gets the kids involved in thinking about technical things. Like, that's how I got interested in engineering. I attribute radio control, flying, and model building directly for me wanting to becoming an engineer. And there's the Academy of Model Aeronautics also has a large outreach program with a number of things, including scholarships. They've put out over $1.2 million in scholarships to support STEM education, and even throughout New England and throughout the whole country, there are programs. A lot of the clubs have outreach programs with the local community and also with organizations like Scouts, Scouts and other educational organizations. Yeah.
Well, I love that, because the reason why I was in a Piper J3 Cub plane a couple of years ago was it was part of a program for kids to co-pilot and fly around. And they do have kids that come out from that and say, oh my God, I want to be an engineer, I want to be a pilot. So Bob, you're in a very specific place in terms of aviation, but are you seeing kids getting excited and wanting to be a part of that community?
Oh, yeah. We have a lot of kids, especially come out that are grandkids of some of the pilots that we have, and they teach their grandsons and granddaughters to fly. And it doesn't make any difference where you are. A lot of them go on to aviation schools.
Mm-hmm.
They like that kid we were talking about before, Garrett. He went to Embry-Riddle on a unmanned pilot program. That was going to be his major, and now it's taken him to new heights. He was written up in AMA magazine for his accomplishments.
So more than just a model plane going into real life.
Yes, absolutely.
It
absolutely.
Is. Yeah, I mean, it makes you think. It stretches the kids' imagination. Some of them are way ahead of their time.
Well, and on that note, does it keep you curious and excited and wanting to continue to do this? I mean, obviously you're enthusiastic already.
It absolutely does, and so we have a number of retired guys in our club and throughout the aero modeling community. But I kind of joke around sometimes that it does take a fair amount of coordination, and you're always learning. It's a lot of hand-eye coordination. And we joke that to try to keep your mind fresh, try flying a radio control aircraft, a plane or a helicopter. It's a lot better than brushing your teeth with your opposite hand, which is So it's really that hand-eye coordination really keeps your interest up and keeps you mentally sharp.
I mean, you're selling that over crosswords for me right now.
Well, it really is a lot of fun because it's a technical thing.
Right.
It's so cool to see the kids get so excited when they come and get a chance to try flying for the first time, and they have the ability to learn so quickly. They literally within probably maybe a couple of dozen flights, they're able to fly with more skill than some of the people that start later in life. That will take them years to get.
Well, we've got about 30 seconds left, but I asked Bob this question earlier. I want to ask you, Ed, is what do you hope our listeners come out from this conversation, get from this conversation? 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. So that aero modeling is a great way to learn some technical skills and have a lot of fun. And also, if people are interested, look up the Academy of Model Aeronautics, Google it, and then there's a local club finder, including ours, RC Prop Busters in Salem, Connecticut, and that's the way to get started.
Well, you just landed that plane perfectly. You've been listening to Edward Deming, who's the president of RC Prop Busters of Salem, Connecticut. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Catherine.
And Bob Curator, who's a crew chief and docent on the Placid Lassie aircraft. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thanks so much for listening and flying with us today.